and a land grant. And tell me when to proceed. Yeah. And I told her that the difference between a land grant and a patent was as follows. The land grant, like any other grant, was simply a gift or a turning over of land or anything else to another person. But on the other hand, a patent was a legal instrument which was comparable to a deed, which went with the land grant, and it was signed, of course, by the Lord of Baltimore. And on this patent, they stated that a date was given, and it gave the man's name, and the fact that he was due certain acreage of ground. It gave the location of the land, it gave the size of it, it gave the name of the tract, and then it gave the metes and bounds so as to locate it exactly and to give the size of it. And then, of course, it was signed by the Lord Baltimore. And in it, of course, it went on to state the requirements of the patentee, the one who would receive the land. Namely, in most cases, simply the paying twice a year of a tax, which in those days they called a quit rent. And they were to be paid to the Lord Baltimore twice a year. And that is undoubtedly the forerunner of our present ground rent system. The ownership of Maryland from the earliest times has been strictly a feudal land system. When King Charles granted it to the Lord Baltimore, he granted him the province of Maryland, but he was supposed to pay the king each year it didn't say when, but he was supposed to pay him each year at Windsor Castle 2 Indian arrowheads and 1/5 of any gold or silver that might be found in the province. It was paid, but the arrowheads were always paid. And we, on the other hand, whatever quit rent was stated, and also 1/5 of any gold or silver. None of us ever found any, but we always had to pay that amount to the Lord Baltimore. That was paid twice a year at Michaelmas and Annunciation Day, and that was usually paid in tobacco. And the way the land was given out, so I explained that too, Mrs. Hopper. And I also reviewed the fact that the way the early land was given out was mainly given as an inducement for coming into the province. The Lord Baltimore gave his new settlers many advantageous rights. And for transporting themselves into the colony, for each person, he would give them 100 acres. If they brought 2 or 3 other people, he'd give them 100 acres each for those individuals. Now, then after 1652, that was reduced to 50 acres per individual. Now then after 1685, the land was then becoming more taken up, and they were called headwrites, and headwrites were no longer used. If you wanted land then, you had to pay caution money to get it. Caution money was, you would find land that was unsettled, had not been taken up, and by paying the Lord Baltimore or his secretary £5 sterling per 100 acres, certainly very reasonable, and then you could apply. They would give you a warrant for a certain number of acres. Then you could apply for this land. Then the official surveyor would survey it and would issue a certificate of survey that would be included within a patent. And the patent, as I say, would describe the land and tell what rent would be payable.
What are metes and bounds?
Metes and bounds are the directions of the lines of the property. Say, beginning at a certain white oak and then running northeast so many perches to a certain other tree, then running due north, let's say, so many perches. Then, in other words, enclosing the land, giving its boundaries,
and what is
the
a
metes
perch?
and bounds. A perch is 16.5 feet, and there were 16.5 feet to the perch, and 320 perches to the mile, 160 square perches to the acre. That was an ancient land measure that was really started by Edward I back in the 1200s. An acre, by the way, originally was that amount of land that an ox team could plow in one day. So different with the land, of course. People of wealth who wanted to and were able to financially transport themselves would pay their passage and come to this country. And for paying their passage, they would receive a certain amount of land, a so-called headright, which was originally 100 acres for each individual. If a man came and brought his wife with him and say 2 children, he would get 100 acres for himself, 100 for his wife, and 50 acres apiece for the 2 children. Now then, in many, many instances, younger sons of noble and great families were not financially able to transport themselves, and they indentured themselves and came over. And it was just similar to borrowing money for the trip. The only thing they could put up, however, would be offering their services, often 7 years of service for the payment of this trip. Now then, in that instance, the individual would receive no land, but the individual who transported him, either the sea captain or some wealthy man who might have been making the trip and paid for the transportation of these individuals, would collect those headrights. Now the individual would search his length of service, and afterwards, after he'd served his time, then the man whom he served would be duty bound to give him usually 50 acres of land and 2 suits of clothes, a barrel of corn, and a barrel of wheat, and certain farm implements to enable him to start in for himself. And many of our settlers did that. And many of them not only did that, but then later thrived to such an extent that they were able to acquire more lands and ended up really as important and landed aristocrats.
Would you like to tell me now how you went about developing your map?
The map.
Yeah.
I had always been interested in the location of the various tracts of land that these people took up. Many of them are my own ancestors, and my father, and I knew many other people who were interested in these lands, and many of them knew the names of the lands and who had owned them, but they were unsure as to the exact location of these lands. And I began to think it would be a very helpful thing to prepare a map on which we laid out the metes and bounds and exact location with the names of these pieces of property, and also with reference to the size and to the land record book in Annapolis, where you can find all of the data about such thing. The first land that concerned me was on the south side of Severn River in Annapolis County. And a good many of those people settled there first, and around beginning with 1650 and running through maybe for the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. Then later, either they or their descendants went up into what is now Howard County, which was then the unsettled frontier, and took up land because they grew tobacco. And after a few years of tobacco growing, the land was being impoverished. There was a need for new land, virgin soil, and Howard County was then the frontier. It was then Annapolis County, and didn't become our district until 1838, and then became Howard County in 1851. But before that, it was the northern part of Annapolis County.
How you actually went about developing that?
So I became obsessed with the idea of trying to prepare a map showing these locations. I first took the south side of Severn River. I made a map for that, which I can show you. And then after I was through with that, various people began to try to interest me in preparing the whole of Howard County in a similar fashion. It was a much larger territory, a little later, but still quite a task. My wife is particularly anxious because she belongs to the DAR chapter, which is in Howard County, the Colonel Thomas Dorsey chapter. And that is strictly a Howard County chapter, and most of the members are from Howard County. And all of those ladies were interested in such a project. And so I started It took me 8 years to prepare the map. And everything has to have a beginning point. My beginning point on that map was a boundary stone, which is still there and can be shown in Miss Dorsey's book on the Dorsey family. She has a photograph of it, and it's marked clearly. The original beginning stone of pushpin, girls' portion, and one of the boundaries of Oregon. So that I knew where that was. So I pinpointed that on my map. And then from that, I drew these others and then enlarged and spread it as I went. The map, I had to have a very large scale map to work on. And that was, for that purpose, I bought these so-called quadrangle maps, which are prepared by the Government Corps of Engineers. They're very large scale, namely 2 5/8 inches per mile. And there were 9 of them to complete Howard County. So I got them and glued them together, making one large map, and drew the piece of land first upon a tracing paper, and then transcribed it upon the map. Then after it was done, then of course I had photostated to secure what I had to have. So the idea was to show exactly where these places were located. And then the places are all labeled, and then I had to go with that an alphabetically arranged list, which gives the name of I have 2 lists. One a list of patentees, and one a list of land grant names. Now it'll give the name of the land grant, the size of it, to whom it was patented, and when it was patented, and then the reference in the land library in Annapolis where such can be seen. The old original Lord Baltimore land records.
Did you do all your research in Annapolis?
In the Hall of Records.
How many days? Every week?
Every Monday I could get off. I went down, and it took me 8 years to do it. Monday was my day off, and I'd take the early bus down to Annapolis. I don't drive, haven't driven for many, many years, and I would take the early bus down, stay all day down in Hall of Records, and then after Hall of Records closed, I'd take the next bus, come up to Baltimore, and then I'd transcribe that, of course, on tissue paper, on tracing paper, and then that'd be transcribed on the map.
Were you able to find all the records you needed?
Yes, I was able to find all of the records, but as you can well imagine, those ancient surveys were not always as accurate as they might have been. Some of our modern surveys are not as accurate as they might be. Sometimes we find our neighbor's property encroaches a little bit. And when that occurred, that land was called foul land because it impinged upon knowledge the original owner owned it. Oftentimes, where people took up or patented numerous tracts of land that were contiguous to one another, and when they had acquired quite a number of such pieces, oftentimes between these areas there would be vacant land. So then the Lord Baltimore gave them the privilege of applying for a resurvey. They could resurvey the entire area and include any vacancies included therein. Then they would get a repatent to that and name it what they wished, all times an entirely new name. And then of course, by that way they would oftentimes acquire many hundreds of acres often. So
Your map shows the first patent on a piece of property in Howard
yes,
County.
the first the Indians owned it, then the King of England owned it. He granted it all to the Lord Baltimore, and the Lord Baltimore granted it to these first settlers, and they're the first settlers that are listed on my map.
So many of these land grants, as they're listed on here, changed names in later years.
Oh, now, most of them have now lost their identity. That was the reason for the map. If you went to Howard County today and asked many people, where's New Year's gift? They wouldn't have the vaguest idea.
Only by your map can you determine this.
Determine exactly where it was and how extensive it was.
But it's hard to know what they might have been called in later years.
Later years it would be impossible to know unless you followed up on deeds. Because a man, for instance, the famous Moore's Morning Choice, now known as Belmont, you've heard of Belmont, of course. Belmont was taken up by Dr. Mordecai Moore. It was sold by him to Caleb Dorsey of Hockley. Caleb Dorsey of Hockley granted it to his son, Caleb Dorsey. Caleb Dorsey left it to his son, Edward, and Edward had many other tracts as well. But Edward had 2 daughters, and he gave each one half of that tract, which was then called Moore's Morning Choice. Now, one girl married Alexander Conti Hansen, and they lived in the house. Then after that division, they called their part Belmont. It had never been called Belmont before. And the other part was called, they called
At Rockburn?
Rockburn. It was called Rockburn, yes. And that other daughter married
Murray.
Daniel Murray. Daniel Murray. And they called that part Rockburn. But originally, since that meant the loss of the old Moore's Morning Joys. If you would ask anyone, they tell you where Belmont was, they tell you where Rockburn was. But if you ask for Moore's Morning Choice, unless you're already sorry, they wouldn't have the biggest idea. But I don't think that would be interesting. This man of 3 brothers was Caleb Dorsey, son of Thomas Field Dorsey, who was the son of Caleb Dorsey of Hockley. Now, Caleb Belmont was the son of Caleb Dorsey of Hockley, who was uncle of this man. Then out there on 3 brothers, the original Caleb Dorsey, who owned New Year's Gift, that was this man's first cousin. He always signed himself Caleb Dorsey, and this man called himself Caleb Dorsey Thomas to differentiate. Now then, another brother was Charles Worthington Dorsey, who lived in this particular center pipe, and that was built on a part of 3 brothers that the father had given this. Now then, the Dorsey Hall, that of course, that was built by another son, the one used to call Old Uncle Cale. Now that was Caleb Dorsey, son of Caleb Dorsey of Thomas. And Linwood, that was where do you know that property? I don't know what they call it now.
Which Linwood? There is another.
There are 3 of them actually, but the old man called it Linwood. I don't know what they call it now. Mrs. Holland would know.
Where exactly?
That is located near the old brick church. In
That's
that
Oak Hall,
vicinity.
that. Is that Oak Hall?
No, Oak Hall. No. It's,
Well, that's Dick Anderson's home on
Is it?
Tamar.
I don't know, and it has a great big pond in front of it.
Yes.
You probably know it.
I know the man who owns it
Do you?
now. Dick and June Anderson.
Is that the
I
name?
recognize the wing.
Oh, I see, yes.
When was that put on?
I don't know.
That was called Linwood?
Yes, that's what my great-grandfather called it. That was also a part of New Year's Gift. Now, my great-grandfather, this was on the part of New Year's Gift that was owned by Larkin Dorsey.
Right. Larkin built Oak Hall, right?
No, I'm wrong.
This was
This was slightly north. This was called Hammond's Connection, and that was just slightly north of New Year's Gift.
Had it been Hammond Land?
Yes, it had been
And
Hammond
Dorsey's
Land.
bought
They
it?
bought it from the Hammonds, and then they bought an adjoining part of New Year's Gift, and they bought that first. Or rather, Caleb bought it and gave it to his son, and then later, John Worthington Dorsey, my great-grandfather, bought another lot there, and then upon which Larkin Dorsey had lived, and upon which he built, of course,
Oak Hall.
Waveland.
Waveland.
That was along the way. What do I? You don't. It's a Dorsey burying ground.
How about Elkhorn? Do you remember anything about
Yeah, I
it?
think so, yeah. Here's a picture. That's interesting.
Have you ever made copies of this and put it in any of the libraries?
No.
Don't you want to?
The only trouble would be a lot of trouble.
Xerox it?
Yeah, but the pictures you see, they would
No,
be
right. You're right about that.
Yeah, here's a picture of Caleb Dorsey Thomas.
Is this in
They
the
had,
church?
they had a church, you see the
St.
church,
Paul's?
St. John's.
At St. John's?
Yeah, because he gave that land for St. John's
Right.
Church. And then this is his wife and first cousin. That picture is Mrs. Joseph Rogers allowed me to photograph that. It's not in bad shape, but that's our picture. And these two, he married his first cousin when she was a gal of 14 years.
Right. Okay, right. Now, the governor of Lincoln married two
he
sisters.
married two daughters of Charles Worthington Dorsey, and they were granddaughters of this man.
It gets so confusing. I don't see how you can keep it straight.
Well, my father started me off.
Oh, well, I guess if you have lived
Yeah.
with it,
Oh,
to me, I have to stop and figure it out. Now, this is a paper about Caleb Dorsey
Dorsey
of Thomas, and
yeah.
how is he related to you?
he was my great-great-grandfather.
He was your great-great-grandfather. Did you know your grandfather?
No, I didn't remember him. He died in 1900,
You
and
were-
just before my father was married.
I see. So
I
you
never knew
knew
him, unfortunately. And his name was Ruth Merrill.
Right, later called Arcadia.
Yes, that's all I did, yeah.
I want to ask you a question. I don't want to
Sure.
take.
This Caleb Dorsey of Hockley was born and raised down in Anne Arundel County on the place called Hockland Hole. Now, he had many different children, and the one named John is the one that he gave
New Year's gift?
a New Year's gift to. And they call that John, they spoke of him as Brick Church John, because he is the one, in company with his father, who gave the 2 acres of land where that little Queen Caroline's
Right.
Parish Church, what's it called, the old Brick Church,
Right.
that's on part of New Year's gift. And they call that John, Brick Church John, because of that. And what else was I going to tell? John had a son, Caleb, who inherited New Year's gift. And this Caleb, at his death, he had 5 sons. The land then, according to the decree of the Court of Chancery in 1801, was divided into 5 pieces, and each one of the 5 sons got one section of it. Now, one section was naturally gotten by the son Larkin Dorsey, and Larkin Dorsey built those Waveland upon that farm. Now then, this Caleb Dorsey of John also had a son by the name of Richard, and Richard was a lawyer, and he built Oak Hall. That was a brother of. Now the one you call Elkhorn, which is gone now, it's burned down. That was built by the old Caleb Dorsey, the father of these 2. And of course it was owned by the Sealings later, and that burned down, now it's no longer existent. But in Oak Hall, that's where Willie Dorsey now lives, isn't it? And where Miss...
Yes.
mhm.
Now, the story is told that those 3 homes that you could see from one home to the other, and they were built with that in mind.
Yes, I think so.
Before the trees, of course, got
Yeah, of
so
course,
large.
I know that Uncle Phil's, when we used to go back to Waveland when we were boys, of course that's where my father was born and raised, and then after his father died, then my uncle, Philip Hammond Dorsey, lived there and farmed it and raised a family. He had no sons, he had 4 daughters, my first cousin, of course. And then later, when he became old, then he sold the land to Mr. Sewell, and Sewell developed the so-called Sewell's Orchards. And the house looks pretty much the same on the other side. How's that been not long ago?
It's beautiful.
Yes.
Now, Mary Parlett is your first
My first cousin, yes indeed.
and she was raised at Waveland?
I was born and raised there, yes indeed she was. And her sister Louise, her sister Florence, and Phyllis, 4 of them.
Right, and then the man, Uncle Reuben, who died at the Owings place.
Oh, that was the father of Uncle Phil, and the father of my father, Caleb.
I see.
He was the judge. He would call him Judge Reuben, my brother Dorsey's uncle, and Judge Reuben Jack.
Right, yes, that's how
Reuben
she...
Jack, yeah. And he was the judge of the orphans' court for many years. And he was the father of them. And he lived at Waveland for many years and died.
And he would have been Mary Parlette's grandfather then?
Mary Parlette's grandfather, that's right. That's right.
And
Exactly.
when do you think that Waveland was built? Is there a record of that in here?
I think so, approximately, yeah, I think approximately. I think so.
This on?
We're looking for the date of Waveland.
Yes. Well, this lot was built by him in the early 1800s. Yeah, because you see the division took place in 1801.
I see.
And we have every reason to assume that he went there and shortly afterwards and built and married.
Right.
And they had no children. And he and his wife they both took people with money. And they had the arrangement between them that when she died, her estate would go to her people. When he died, his estate would go to his people. Larkin Dorsey died May 31st, 1837.
Then what was the relationship of Larkin Dorsey to the judge?
To Judge Ruth Marable, let me
Is
see.
he an uncle then?
No, wait a minute. Larkin Dorsey was the son of, Larkin Dorsey was the son of Caleb. And Caleb was the brother, no, was the first cousin of Caleb of Thomas. Caleb of Thomas. They were their third cousins, I would say.
But would this man have inherited it, or would he have bought
Oh,
it?
no, he bought it. He bought
I
it.
see.
Oh, yeah. In other words,
When Larkin Dorsey died?
Larkin Dorsey died, and then this was bought by Judge Ruth Marable, the Dorsey father, John Burlington Dorsey.
I see.
He bought it from the estate of Larkin Dorsey, you see.
And he lived there
Yeah,
then?
here we are. On November the 21st, he after the death of, oh no, sorry, it's a good message. Yeah. On November 28, 1838, John W. Dorsey killed Thomas, bought from Jane Dorsey and James McKinley Boyd, widow and ex-secretary of Dorsey's property known as Lot 5, conveying 140 acres. Part of the news gift cards, part of the so forth. Understand?
It went into the estate, well, were these his brothers and sisters?
Jane
or-
was his widow.
Oh,
Jane
his
was
widow,
yeah.
widow.
And
And
this
then
was
who
the appointed to executor with the widow. Yeah, that was it.
Because you just assume that everything was inherited, but that's not true.
Oh, I know. No, that would be the reason. It would be so difficult to know how many acres the Dorseys possessed there because you would know how much they took up by land grabs. And from the wills you would tell how much they inherited. But they bought so darn much, you know.
What can you tell me about the John Worthington Dorsey of Linwood? Now, how was he?
John Worthington Dorsey of Linwood was the son of Caleb Dorsey of Thomas, and he was my great-grandfather. He was a very large man. He was called Timber-Leg John because he was 6'6". He was in the army. They fought in the War of 1812. He was in the 32nd Maryland Regiment, and he was
What war was that?
1812.
My
1812.
goodness.
Yes, and that's right.
Your great
Grandfather.
grandfather.
Yes. Now, before him, old Caleb Dorsey of Thomas, because of his association with the Ellicotts, was a non-combatant. He didn't believe in warfare.
Was he an actual Quaker or just
No, but he had just inherited some of those debts. No, because he gave the land for St. John's Church, so he was paying for the divorce. But I got into the SAR through him because he took the oath of allegiance, and also he bought the services of a band to substitute for him in the Revolutionary War, and he quit it.
That was quite.
That was known as a Revolutionary Service.
What was that called?
A Revolutionary Service. And you have to prove a Revolutionary Service of an ancestor in order to become an SAR or a DAR.
Right.
This man, John Whitman Dorsey, as I say, he was 6'6", and
Timberlake?
Timberlake John.
Now, where would the name Timberlake?
Because he was so long, he was such a big, tall fellow, he was 6'6".
Yeah.
He was a very high-tempered man, and there was a property line that separated him from a neighbor, and he and the neighbor were constantly bickering over this property line. So on one occasion, he told him. So he said to his neighbor, "We've been arguing over this property line long enough. There's only one way to settle it. I hereby challenge you to a duel. One or the other of us will be killed, and the one that remains, his idea of where the line should be will be the correct one." So the man whom he had challenged couldn't well back out for their short cowardice. So, and by being the challenged party, he could select his weapons. So he had no desire to fight the sword of a man 6'6". So he said, "Very well, I accept the challenge, but I will insist upon pistols, and only the genuine pistols called for by the English Code of Dueling. No other pistols will I fight with." He thought there were none to be had. So the great-grandfather told him, "Very well, sir, I'll either borrow them, or damn, if I can't get any, I'll go to England and get some." And he couldn't borrow any in the vicinity. He took the stagecoach from Elephant's Mills to Baltimore, got on the sailing vessel, went to Liverpool, bought a box of beautiful dueling pistols, returned. When he went to our county again, his neighbor had sold it and fled. And those dueling pistols were used in 3 duels, and 3 men have been killed by them.
Are they still?
They're in the Maryland Historical Society. I presented them.
Oh,
And I'm glad I did, because I had a very bad fire not long after it burned up practically everything I had on the face of the earth, so they were gone if I hadn't done that.
And about when was this duel challenge?
I would say, probably shortly after 1812. I'd say maybe 1815 or 1818 or thereabouts.
And when do you think this house Linwood was built?
Was built?
Was it built at that time? Was he
It kind of, when he married Mary Ann Hammond, it wasn't built then, because his father gave him this property, and there was certainly no house about it then. And when they first were married,
When were they married?
I'd have to look it up.
Okay.
When they were first married, old Major Philip Hammond gave his daughter a piece of that Hammond property down in Russell County. And they went down there, the newlyweds, and lived in a little log cabin in the woods for a couple of years. And then they built this house, so it must have been built a few years after their marriage. I don't want to waste your time. John William Dorsey of Linwood was born January the 3rd, 1791, and he died July the 14th of 1841. He married on November the 28th, 1815, Mary Ann Hammond, daughter of Major Philip Hammond and Elizabeth, his wife. She was born November 29th of 1796 and died in August of 1877.
Did they have children?
Oh yes, yes, all these. All of these. He was very well with my grandfather.
All right. Now, was your grandfather raised at Linwood, or was he raised at Wakeland, or?
He was, wait a minute, he was raised at, no, he was raised at Linwood. Raised at Linwood.
But you didn't know him because he had
No,
died then.
unfortunately he died at 44.
Did you know the Hawkins? This is Judge Thomas?
Yeah,
Beale?
Judge Thomas Beale Dorsey, who was chief judge of chief judge of the Supreme Bench, was the son of Colonel John Worthington Dorsey and his wife Comfort Worthington.
Were they related to you?
Oh, yes, yes indeed. Colonel John Worthington Dorsey was the younger brother of Caleb Dorsey of Thomas.
Right.
And so this man had various children. Now one of them was named Samuel Worthington Dorsey, and he went to Louisiana. He married a Miss Ellis, who was from Mississippi, and I suppose that's how they knew the Jefferson Davis family.
Can you recall that connection? The Dorseys with the Davises? Do you recall?
When it happened?
Or what the friendship was?
No, only that he went to Louisiana and married a Miss Ellis who came from Mississippi. And Jefferson Davis, of course, was from Mississippi. In fact, he was a U.S. Senator from Mississippi before the Civil War.
Did your research show any
And a relationship.
Or Dorsey's giving any property to Jefferson?
Oh yes, oh yeah, definitely so. Yeah, oh yes.
What?
After the war,
The Civil War? No. Which
Civil War. Jefferson Davis and his family lost everything they had, and then the widow of Samuel Worthington Dorsey gave her home down there called Beauvoir, and gave it to Jefferson Davis, where he lived and where he died. Now, after his death, his widow sent back to some of the Dorsey women two daughters of Henry Goodwin Dorsey, numerous household articles and things. And I don't know whether she returned the property to them, but she returned many household articles which Jefferson Davis had used during his life. John Worthington Dorsey, my great-grandfather, was an intimate friend of Colonel Charles Sterrett Ridgely, who owned and occupied Oakland Manor. And he was an intimate friend of his, as I say. And his son, I don't remember which one, was going to fight a duel, and he wanted to borrow these dueling pistols from my great-grandfather. But my great-grandfather tried to dissuade him, and told him that, after all, said, all of your sons, General, have been killed. It's the only remaining one. And I would certainly beg you to try to change his mind if you can. And General said no. He said he has to go through with it. So he loaned him the pistols, and young Richard was killed.
At Oakland Manor? Do you know where the duel took place?
I don't know where it took place, no.
Do you know the question or what they were doing?
No. And I don't know who killed him. But he was killed from the pistols.
Tell me then about your grandfather in the Civil War. Some of the things you recall.
Well, he had a brother whose name was Charles Worthington Dorsey, and he was more or less an unreconstructed rebel. He was commonly known as Devil Charlie. After the war, as I say, he didn't settle down, much been said, but during the war, he fought with Mosby's guerrillas, and of course they ranged through the mountains of Virginia and so forth. And from time to time, they would come up and visit at Waveland. And then also, my grandfather's wife had a brother whose name was Charles Philip Croft, and he was a Confederate spy, and he would often stop at Waveland, and often the place was searched by Yankee troops, but they never captured any of them. On one occasion, my grandfather was down in Ellicott City, and some of the northern troops were coming down from Frederick, where they had been defeated pretty badly. And the grandfather was standing in the streets, and he saw them walking by rather dejectedly. So he yelled at the top of his voice, "Who are but Jeff Davis?" So one of the officers stepped forward and grabbed him. "You damn rebel, you!" Put his gun to his head and said, "Say that again, I'll blow your brains, sir." And the old man said, Hoorah to Jeff Davis. He kept his brains, and blew up his brains. And after the war, the Dorseys had a bad name for being Southern sympathizers, and quantitative official representatives of government came getting people to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. And when my grandfather heard that they were coming up to get him to take the oath, he told him, damned if I'll take the oath of allegiance to the United States government, and said, don't take it, said they'll take property and confiscate it. He said, well, I'm not confiscate, I'm not going to take it. But then his overseer said, come on, let me take it. He said, I don't know who I am. He said, I'll take the oath. So then the officials came up, and the overseer stepped forward. Yeah, sure, I'm Willoughby Marable Dorsey. Took the oath of allegiance, walked off.
Didn't know who it was.
No, didn't know who it was. The old man kept his property and never did take the oath of allegiance to the United States government. So he was very much Southern.
Tell her about the time that Croft came in dressed as
A Jewish peddler.
Jewish peddler.
One time, Reuben Meriwether Dorsey, my grandfather, married a girl whose name was Mary Eliza Croft, K-R-A-F-F-T. Her father was the Prussian consul to Baltimore. And my grandfather had no idea of any relationship, but on her mother's side, she also descended from the Dorseys. Well, anyhow, she had a brother who was a lawyer and a very clever man. He was a single man and rather a daredevil and a strong Southern sympathizer. And as I say, he was deeply involved in espionage. And he had also swum the Potomac River with a waterproof sack of quinine on his head because they need quinine on the Virginia side of the river very badly. So oftentimes he would disguise himself as a Jewish peddler. From his father, he had learned the German language very well, and he could, of course, speak Yiddish very well because of that knowledge. And often he'd disguise himself as a Jewish peddler and travel around, unknown because of the price on his head. And often he'd pop up and wave a little when the least expected. And he'd always test his disguise on his sister. So one time he popped it in and banged on the door, and my grandmother went to the door, and he forced his way in to want to buy something. And she said she didn't want to, and finally when she was quite frightened, and he laughed and said, Minnie, don't you know me? And then he, of course, made known his identity. He had with him a great quantity of gold coins, and he wanted to get them over the line, over the Southern troops, but he couldn't do so at that time, so he was wearing this money belt. So he gave it to his sister and said, Minnie, said, you wear these things for me. He said, I'll come back when I can more likely make a safe exit. He said, you wear them, and said, if I come through this thing, and I come back, said, you can have half of them, and I'll take the other half down to the Southern forces. And said, so she wore them under her dress and said they were terribly heavy. Said she remembered. She wore them for quite a while. Finally, he popped in again. Took half of them, went south with his coins.
And tell about the time he hid in the cupboard.
Oh, yes. We have a wardrobe. My sister has it now. And that was in her bedroom. And so the Yankee troops suddenly popped up from behind every bush, knocked on the door, said, we understand that there's a Southern sympathizer hiding here, and we demand right to search the house. So my grandfather, Reuben Marable, said, well, gentlemen, said, there are many of you and only one of me. Said, I can't prevent you. Said, but my wife is ill in one of the bedrooms upstairs, and any man cross that threshold, I'm going to kill. Says, all right, we won't bother her. So they went upstairs and they searched everywhere. Well, in the meanwhile, old Charlie was in the house. So he wanted a place to hide. He couldn't get out. So he went in the wardrobe, pulled out of big velvet dresses in there, and he went in the wardrobe and hid himself behind all these dresses. And the troops came by and they searched everywhere. And finally one of them came and opened the door and looked in, saw this lady laying in bed ill, and I think just 400 children. At any rate, and then he went out again. And they started downstairs, and then she called back to her husband and said, watch him, Jack, they'll steal. And many people say it was very foolish of her, but it might have been very wise of her. because they probably didn't suspect. If any woman had a brother hiding in the room, she would never have ventured in such insult as that. But they slacked and went on with the business. Then the brother, of course. There were three original Dorsey brothers, the oldest being named Colonel Edward Dorsey, the next one being Joshua Dorsey, and the third and youngest was named Honorable John Dorsey. Honorable because he was on the legislature and so forth. He had two sons, and his elder son was Edward Dorsey, who died and left two children. One was named Edward and one named John, and that John was named, that was called Patuxent John Dorsey. And he inherited from his grandfather, Honorable John, Dorsey's Search in that property up there. So Dorsey Hall is built upon Dorsey's Search.
Do you have any idea of when it was built?
Nobody knows exactly. Moorfields are of the opinion that Patuxent John Dorsey built it. Some historians say it was built later than that. Personally, I don't know. I know my grandfather's uncle, Caleb Dorsey, lived there and died there. But now whether he built the property or whether the house was on him when he bought the property, that we know. But whether the house was on him when he bought it or whether he built the house, I don't know. No one knows that exactly. They were originally Norman French and descended from Rollo. Norman Dorsey was the first one who came over to England, and he came over and fought with the Conqueror. And he was given many lordships in Lincolnshire because of these services. His father was William, Count of Arqueus, pronounced Archie. And that's how the name originated, because this William was the Count of Archie. Archie is the name of a little village and of the castle which stands near the village of Dieppe in Normandy. In England, after a few generations, the name was further anglicized and was spelled D-A-R-C-Y, leaving off the apostrophe. And in England today, the name, of course, is still spelled D-A-R-C-Y. The name was never spelled Dorsey until they came here. And during the first generation, the name is spelled both Darcy and Dorsey. But then later, of course, now, it is only spelled Dorsey in this country. In England, though, the few Darcys that remain spell it D-A-R-C-Y.